Well, we've been in the midst of this saga of Jacob, and when we last left him, he was on his way back to Mesopotamia, back to Haran, after his dream of a stairway to heaven and God's assurance that he would be with him, that the covenant promise of Abraham and Isaac from God would go through Jacob now. Jacob finally makes his way back to the ancestral home, and there he meets one of his kin, his cousin Rachel, by a well. Remember, the well is the place to find a date in Genesis. So you go back there to do that. And again, it seems to be the place. And so Jacob is attracted to her and wants to make her his wife. Now, Rachel is the daughter of Jacob's uncle, Laban. So she is his first cousin. Laban is Jacob's mother's brother. You got all that? You got your ancestry DNA cap on? Okay, I want to make sure you got this all square. Okay. Jacob, we have learned, is a schemer. And it seems that that trait runs in the family. Laban agrees to give Rachel to him in marriage. Great. But only if Jacob will work for Laban for 7 years. That's going to be the bride price. Well, Jacob serves his 7 years, and finally it's the wedding night, the first night with his beloved, and there's a great party, as was the custom back then, and they go in for the honeymoon, and the next morning, when Jacob wakes up, he's not been with Rachel, he's been with the older sister Leah. They swapped brides on him. I don't know how this happens. I suspect it has something to do with veils and heavy drinking, but there it is. Now, Jacob, the deceiver, has been deceived. He confronts Laban, who agrees to finally give him Rachel, but only if he'll promise to work another 7 years for him. So Jacob does that, and now Jacob has 2 wives who are sisters, and this works out beautifully. No, it does not. Leah, who is unloved, has 7 children by Jacob. Rachel has none. She is barren like Rebekah and Sarah before her. She blames Jacob. Give me children or I will die. And so she enters into this contest with Leah, her sister, by having her servant girl sleep with Jacob to produce children for her. Rachel eventually does bear a child, Joseph, who we'll talk about next week. Now that's just a taste of this story. There's no soap opera that can compare with this. This is days of our lives on steroids, okay? I got into this detail a little bit in this week's midweek Bible break, so if you really want to dive into it, you can do that on our YouTube channel. But can you imagine what the film adaptation would look like to this story? Actually, there is a novel called The Red Tent by Anita Diamant, who writes about this story. She takes a little liberty with the biblical text, but it's crazy to us to think about all of this. Eventually, though, Jacob becomes prosperous. He becomes very good at tending the flocks, and Laban makes a deal with him that he'll get to keep some of the flocks, and eventually God calls Jacob to go back home to Canaan, to the land of his father Isaac, of his grandfather Abraham. But we know that in returning back to Canaan, Jacob is going to have to face his brother Esau. Remember what Jacob did to Esau? Swapped him out of his birthright, cheated him out of his blessing. Last time he saw Esau, Esau wanted to kill him. Now he's got to go back and face him. And so afraid is Jacob that on the way, he decides when they get to the border there, he sends his family and all of his flocks on ahead of him. Honey, you go first. You go meet him and tell him that everything is great, that all these flocks can be his, that I'm coming in peace, all those kinds of things. And so he's left alone by the river as he does this. And in the middle of the night, I love how the text puts this. It's very nonchalant. And a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Where does this come from? It's like WWE just emerges out of nowhere in the middle of the night. The text calls this unexpected opponent a man, but when the nocturnal brawl ended, Jacob said that he had seen God face to face. So whomever Jacob struggled with that night, he thought he'd gone 15 rounds with God. Now, certainly, if you were to set up a match between a mortal and God, God has to be the heavyweight favorite. But in this night-long struggle, we find no indication that God was wiping the ground with Jacob at any moment. Rather, God seems to limit his power so that the fight is a fair one, and Jacob holds his own. He isn't whipping this celestial combatant, but he's not embarrassing himself either. As dawn breaks, this mysterious adversary knocks Jacob's hip out of joint and insists that Jacob let him go. But Jacob refuses unless this God/man will bless him. Jacob needs the assurance that he's going to be the one to carry the promise, because when he crosses over the river the next day, he could be facing certain death. Rather than simply bless Jacob, the antagonist gives Jacob a new name. Your name is no longer Jacob, it's now Israel. Israel means one who strives with God, one who wrestles with God. Now notice what that name implies. It becomes a name for a whole nation. A people who would wrestle with God and wrestle within themselves over the whole issue of covenant. From Jacob onward, Israel is going to engage in a constant battle against the desire to be like everyone else. They would struggle, they would suffer, wrestle, even limp about in their efforts to follow God's leading. But God will not let them go, even as Jacob wouldn't let God leave without blessing him. So having received this new name, Jacob asks his opponent for his name. Now, this is no small request if you understand the greater context of the ancient world. Jacob wants to understand the mystery of heaven and earth. You may recall that God's name was so holy that no one in ancient Israel would dare to speak it. Remember later on in Exodus when Moses asked God his name, what does God say? I am who I am. What kind of name is that? It's not the name. He's not getting the name that he wants. There's also a sense that if you knew a deity's name, you could somehow manipulate that deity, like in an incantation. But the God of Israel will not be manipulated in this way. So the stranger is not giving up the name. The opponent blesses Jacob, but he will not give Jacob everything that he wants. Some things have changed, but others remain as unsettled as they were when the match began. Now, the sun comes up, and the stranger says, let me go, because remember, in the ancient world and in the understanding of the Hebrews, to see God face to face meant that the mortal would die. And so now he wants to be let go to preserve Jacob's life. But he says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And he does bless him. And it reminds him that God is going to be with him as he goes across the river the next day. The stranger disappears, and Jacob is going to limp away with less than he sought from this all-night battle. He survived seeing God face to face, and he received a blessing, but he didn't get God's name. So who won the match? We're a culture that values winners and losers. Somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. But the lines here aren't so clear. God wrestles Jacob, but doesn't crush him. Jacob holds his own, but he has a limp. Jacob is wounded and sore, but he doesn't seem to be a sore loser, for he has received more than he has ever expected. He's no longer merely Jacob, the deceiver. He is now Israel, the one who strives with God. Now, on a literal level, this story is kind of strange to us. It's not that difficult to understand when we plug it into our own experience. We talked last week about Jacob's dream, about the dark night of the soul, the fact of that stairway to heaven that Jacob dreams about, and God standing beside him saying, I will be with you. But in this nighttime struggle, God is not standing beside Jacob, he's actually attacking him. And that leaves us with an interesting theme, an image of God, God the attacker. That's a disquieting picture of God. Pastor Bob, you sure you want to say that, God the attacker? But if we think about it, God's role as attacker isn't that hard to comprehend. Haven't we sometimes experienced God as the one who needles us to change, who provokes us to try harder, who bullies his way through our defenses to demand our commitment, who hounds us to surrender to him? In other words, this is no mamby-pamby deist God who stands by the wayside and just lets things play out, waiting for us to notice him. When it suits his purposes, on the other hand, God is an in-our-face figure who confronts us through our conscience, through other people, through Scripture, through worship, through gut-wrenching situations, and through a whole lot of other means to pressure us to deal with him. In those times, it's not that we can't find God, it's that we can't get God off our back. Ever experienced something like that? It's interesting, the irony of Scripture is that God doesn't just attack those who are coming against him. We think God should attack Israel's enemies, his enemies, and that does happen, but in many cases, the people whom God attacks are not enemies of God. They are the people who are either actively attempting to do God's will or who are at least expected to play a crucial role in passing on the divine covenant. But the fact that God takes action against those who are obediently loyal to him suggests that there is a tough love component to God's compassion. Perhaps one aspect of God's love is like that of a parent who puts obstacles in the way of an obedient child to make the child learn the hard but necessary lessons that enable movement toward maturity. Or as the writer of Proverbs puts it, for the Lord reproves the ones that he loves. I read once about a similar dynamic that was in the legendary Green Bay Packers and their legendary coach Vince Lombardi. Sports writers noticed that Lombardi seemed to pick on one particular player on the sidelines, always criticizing him, always yelling at him. And a Green Bay pastor had one of the players who came to the church there. And so one day after church, he asked him, he said, are the sports writers right? Does Lombardi seem to just pick out this one guy all the time? And the player said, oh yeah, he does. Actually, he's Coach Lombardi's favorite. He's his favorite. We have to remember, too, that God picks on his favorites. God's own son was not immune from wrestling with God. Jesus wrestled with his call. He wrestled with those who would oppose his message of grace. We see Jesus wrestling so hard with the will of God in the Garden of Gethsemane that his sweat pours out like drops of blood. That indicates a titanic struggle. That scene is an echo of Jacob's own wrestling before he confronts Esau. Jesus is about to confront the powers of sin and death. You know, if you go to the Garden of Gethsemane, it sits at the base of the Mount of Olives, and you look up at the walls of Jerusalem there in the Kidron Valley. And Jesus, as he's praying, can look up at those walls and know that he knows that the next day he's going to the cross. What you don't realize is that a 5-minute walk down the Kidron Valley would have taken him out into the desert where he could have disappeared and avoided all of it. But he stayed on the mat. He stayed in the match. Father, not my will, but yours. Take this cup from me, but I'll do your will, not my own. Jesus wrestles. Jacob had a new name at the end of his wrestling match. His name was Israel. Jesus has taken on the role of Israel in person, the role of Israel's Messiah, the one to whom the covenant had pointed from the beginning. Jesus wrestles with this mission, and while it seems that he loses by dying on a Roman cross the next day, we know that that's actually a triumph over the powers of sin and death. See, the irony is Jesus won by losing. Jacob won by losing. And so do we. We win by losing. We win by allowing God to have his way in our lives. Jacob's glory in this dusk to dawn duel is not that he went looking for trouble, but rather that when it found him, when he was faced with the most formidable of foes possible, he stayed with the struggle until he had received God's blessing. And that's where our glory comes in too. When God assails us with guilt or menaces our comfort with an unwanted challenge, we always have the option to deny the reality of the experience, to attribute it to crazy thoughts or an overactive imagination. But better than denial is going to the mat with God and staying in the struggle till we have wrung from God the blessing He wanted us to have all along. The 4th century father St. Augustine gives us one flavor of that experience when he tells of the brutality of God's call on him. Augustine says that God attacked him through his senses. He says of God, "You called and shouted and burst my deafness. You flashed, shone, scattered my blindness. You breathed odors and I drew in breath and panted for you. I tasted and hungered and thirsted. You touched me and I burned for your peace." Does that sound like a gentle, still, small voice of God? Sometimes God speaks to us in that way, but sometimes God shouts. Another pastor was talking about his call to ministry. He said he'd been feeling the quiet tug of God for quite some time, but he wasn't interested. And then he says, God started to shout at me. It seemed that he could hardly get through the day without something in his usual routine, something taking on a confrontational meaning. And what had been a gentle, please respond, became a provocative, well, what are you going to do about this? The pastor says that when he finally yielded, he was blessed with great peace and joy. In our traditional services today, we're singing the hymn that Charles Wesley wrote about his own call, and the title of the hymn is "Come, O Thou Traveler Unknown." And he writes about his own wrestling with God. So in that dark night of the soul, not only are we sometimes wrestling with the absence of God, sometimes we're wrestling with the presence of God who wants to change us and modify us and move us and give us a new name and a new purpose. And that's when we have to really stay in it, because that's where the blessing comes. We might discuss this in terms of perspective. See, when we encounter God, we undergo a change in worldview, an attitude adjustment. Jacob could have said, well, I got whipped and I have the limp to prove it. Or he could say, but I also got a new name. I got a new purpose. And it's clear from the text, too, that Jacob had learned from his mistakes. He came clean. The next day, he crosses over the river, and he finally sees his brother Esau coming toward him. Can you imagine the terror? Here was a person who wanted to kill him. He had done terrible things to his brother. But Esau runs toward him. And instead of lifting a knife, Esau embraces Jacob. He throws his arms around his neck and he kisses him. And Genesis 33, verse 4 says they wept together. The struggle had a payoff. From pain often comes reconciliation with God and with each other. See, God is in the business of change, of changing us. We encounter God and we're a different person with a different name. We might have asked for this, but we got that. We might not have gained what we wanted, but we got what God wanted for us. And we might be sore losers in all of that. Coming away limping from an encounter with God. No, the struggle is not pleasant. Our pride may be wounded, our bodies may be tired, our minds, though, may be abuzz with new possibilities. But when we stay in that struggle, we can come out the other side like Jacob with a new name. One who strives with God. You know, a lot of people expect faith to be easy and to yield easy answers, to be a panacea against problems. And suddenly when you become a Christian, it's all puppies and rainbows from there. But the truth is that following God is often more like a wrestling match. If you're going to follow, expect there to be a struggle. Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Not a symbol of comfort. I know many of you are struggling right now. Struggling with something. Something that's nagging at you, something that's tugging at you, a problem, an inner struggle, something from your past. Jacob shows us that it's often only in struggle that we can experience the blessings that God has in store for us, if we're willing to stay in it and not give up. What are you wrestling with this morning? What might God be challenging you to do or to be? What in you needs to be changed? What needs to be renamed? Go to the mat with God. And don't let go until you've received the blessing God wants to give you. Now, you will likely come away with a limp like Jacob. Anyone who's walked with God for any long period of time knows the limp I'm talking about. It's a reminder of the struggle. But you'll also find a new way forward. Because you see, when it comes to wrestling with God, it's always best to be the sore loser.